George P. Wakefield, 1910 to 2001. George Patterson Wakefield was born in Vermilion, Ohio, the son of Frederick William Wakefield and Mary Poley. He graduated from Vermilion High School in 1928 and attended Finn Engineering School, Cleveland, 1930 to 1932, and Ohio University in 1933. Mr. Wakefield retired in 1970 as chief engineer after 38 years of service with the F.W. Wakefield Brass Company in Vermilion. He held 18 lighting patents for the company, 4 private patents. He also had a career as a columnist and local historian. He was a columnist and poet for the Vermilion News, 1938 to 1964, and columnist for the Vermilion Photojournal, 1988 to 2001. His awards for writing include the Anchor Award from the Vermilion Chamber of Commerce for covering Vermilion history and the Great Lakes Fisherman's Tug Award for adding to the fishing history of Lake Erie. The following clips are from his Vermilion Views in the Photojournal. Postcard Perfect View of a Dreamy Stream by George Wakefield. Here is a postcard showing the Rocky River sailing fleet in the harbor on Labor Day in 1905. The card was sent to Charles Horton on the steamer Pathfinder by Anna Backstein, Charlie's girlfriend. It bears a 1-cent stamp on the back. Starting at the left and going to the right is the Duplex Hot Water Heater Company building. This was recently demolished to make room for car parking at the new rest home on Douglas Street, where it had been moved some 78 years ago. The building stood at the riverside where Reed Wakefield's house is today. The next building is Tomball Shanty, which stood about where Dr. Stack's house is today. It is impossible to identify the yachts, although I believe the tall-masted cutter in front of the ball shanty is either the Grayling or the Meteor. The beamy boat to the right almost has to be the result owned by Fuller, Bierce, and Woodward of Cleveland. She was the beamiest yacht in the Lakewood Yacht Club's fleet. Across the river where the Paulsons' house is today are 2 shanties of unknown origin. I have heard squatters live there in years past. The harbor in those days was a quiet and placid stream with several silent steam tugs moving in and out, and occasionally a drumming of an early gas boat which perked up the dreamy riverfront. Turn of the Century Harbor, The Long Run, by George Wakefield. This postcard photo was taken near McGarvey's and shows how the long run in the river looked in 1903. We sailor boys with our homemade converted rowboats preferred this part of the stream for a long reach or run when the lake was too sloppy outside. The fish tugs visible left to right are the steamer William D. Ames. Of the Driscoll Company, the gas boat Leo A. by Walker and Holmgren. On the land where the Mose Marina is today, is the steam tug Favorite originally owned by Bert Parsons, perhaps laid up. Next comes the pile-driving barge used for pound nets by the Leidheiser House, the XL. Vern Leidheiser once recited this ditty to me.
The old XL could go like hell, but never the other tugs excel.
The steamer in front of the Leidheiser shanty is the James P. Devaney and open-deck tug. Next in line is the J.L. Wyland near the foot of Toledo Street owned by Edson and Nichols. In the blur is the Parsons Fish House and then the Kishman House. In front is the Pioneer Steamer Telephone, an early open-decker with a very modern name. This picture is a rare and interesting rendering of the turn-of-the-century harbor. If there are others around, we would like to show them. Betty Trinter had this one in her files, and we are grateful for the exposure. Buttermilk Days Are Gone, But Boathouse Remains, by George Wakefield. At the east side of the river, just north of the old wagon bridge, stood Bill Showalter's boathouse as depicted in this 1918 postcard. It appears as though Bill is sitting in the doorway with his son Bill Jr. They moved to Cocoa, Florida, and his wife sitting on a chair, holding his straw hat. There are three other chaps lolling around to the right, including a dog. Note the interesting signs tempting the prospective customer. Even fresh buttermilk. Bill was a jovial fellow and liked kids much like his brother, George, who was engineer on the steam tug Rainbow of the Kishman fleet. Bill ran the power launch Marion in the river and lake, sometimes stopping at the Linwood Park and Crystal Beach piers for passengers. After the Showalters moved south, the Whitehursts bought the place and used it for a fish house for their trap nets. They were two brothers who hailed from Pamlico Sound in North Carolina and had the distinction of being the only Carolina fishermen to fish on the freshwater sea, Lake Erie. This building is now owned by Alva Snell and looks very much as it did in 1918. Alvy was kind enough to submit this reminder of river history. Local thrill seekers tried rowboats. By George Wakefield. This 1910 postcard shows the boat landing at Crystal Beach Park at the beginning of the shale banks where a creek ran into the lake. The power launch Edna D. is loading passengers for a joy ride in the lake and river. She was owned by Jim and Lou Dahl, the local Ford dealer. To supplement their automobile business, they ran the sightseeing boat on weekends. Standing beside the boat holding her off is Jim, while his brother is standing on board, hoping more passengers would be brave enough to meander down the hill and add to those already aboard. The Edna D. was the first fast powerboat in the river. She could do 14 miles per hour. She was a novelty to inlanders who attended the farmers' picnics that were so popular in those years. The rowboats were towed over by the Dahl boat from the Foster Boathouse on the west side of the river. Foster is standing on the dock waiting for inept farmers to splash the oars in attempting to row. In 1910, a rowboat was one of the big thrills of the day. Has anyone seen a rowboat lately? Excitement on the Rocks. By George Wakefield. Here is an interesting postcard snapped in 1916 by an enterprising photographer. There are quite a few of these cards left around town in scrapbooks and drawers, but few folks know the story involved. Here it is as the evidence reveals itself. The view is at the mouth of the hometown stream, showing the lovely old lighthouse as it used to be. The sailboat stranded on the East Pier is one of the typical Rocky River yachts that cruised to the fishing port in those years. She perhaps was sailing too close to the underwater pier stones that were left there by the contractor to snag unsuspecting yachtsmen. The crowd watching our pier superintendents brimming with suggestions of how to. They are having the best show in town, and Mr. Burns, the lighthouse keeper, has even allowed his friends to view the scene from this hallowed sanctuary at the upper deck. The boat in the middle has a line on the stranded yacht. She is Cloud's Ferry, the Gertrude, while the long boat to the left is the Edna D. With a line on the ferry to assist. Jib Snyder's Owl is in between, ready to lend a helping hand to Cloudy. The boat to the left foreground is unnamed and unknown, but I have seen her in pictures. So, all in all, we have a cooperative spirit on hand at the mouth of the Vermilion River on a Sunday afternoon 72 years ago. Luck Compass Help Locals Weather Freeze. By George Wakefield. Here is a rare view of a steam tug arriving in port after braving a winter gale on Lake Erie. She is the steel-hulled George Edward fishing out of Lorraine in 1926, owned by Jack Morrison of Vermilion. She is shown here opposite the shipyard, docking at the fish house on the west side. Other locals aboard are Alva Snell at the left. I can tell him from his stance, with Frati Martinek alongside. Captain Jack is to the right of the stack. The actual date of this memorable trip was December 22nd, 1926, when she left port to pull nets. Coming in, she collected her ice sheath in the gale and blizzard. Alva told me that not only was visibility zero, but the lighthouse light was out. This made the search for the port very difficult in the days before radar, when skippers had to use just compass and luck. Incidentally, Alva Snell is the last of the local gill netters. Congratulations, Alvy, for all the luck you have had in your long life on the inland seas. How Low Can Lake Erie Go? By George Wakefield. Seldom do we have an opportunity to see such low water in Lake Erie here at Vermilion. But this is a picture taken around 1938 near the foot of Main Street. No, the tide is not out. The lake was then at a low period, and a strong west wind had pushed the water eastward, a common occurrence sometimes called a seiche. The Big Rock is Old Table Rock, the famous watermark so well known to local swimmers for over 100 years, since the big erosion of 1830 when it was a landmark. Many a youngster grew up and went in the deep river after he made the last stroke to Table Rock. Photo from Edna Ligelba collection. Nickel Rides, Marshland, Cloudy's Place. By George Wakefield. High water at Cloudy's. This photo, taken about 1927 from the West Pier, shows the spring flood of that year. Cloudy ran the ferry boat between his store, the white shed at the right, and his dock at the waterworks. This picturesque route for Linwood Parkers to go to and from the town was a fun run for a nickel. Cloudy, the river character, and the sand path from the river to Linwood provided an adventure to remember. One of those prime experiences that grandfathers talk about. But back to the flood again. Cloudy's house was moved east to higher ground on the sand ridge and is visible to the left of the store. He had had enough of wet feet. With the water at the level shown, the whole marshland from the New York Central Railroad to the lake was flooded. To the left in the photo is a house on a barge, the first houseboat in Vermilion. It was built about 1920 just north of Huron Street near the river. I recall it listed considerably due to the house being off-center. It stayed at Cloudy's on land as shown until it landed to the east of the Leidheiser Fish House. There it rested for a few years among the lily pads. Ultimately, it was put high and dry on South Street opposite the school, and it became Gramps' Candy Store and is there to this day. When Vermilion Was a Fish Town. By George Wakefield. Wharf days were fish days when this picture was taken. Here we see the steam tug C.A. Madison heading for the Kishman Fish Company dock to unload, followed by the Charles A. Potter of the Leidheiser Company. They had just raced in and are now slowing down. In the foreground is none other than the river character, Jib Snyder, in his fish tug, the Owl. If you didn't know Jib, you were not a native. Vermilion, with its Kishman, Leidheiser, Driscoll, Parsons, and Lamp Fish Companies, was the third largest producer of perch, pike, herring, and whitefish on Lake Erie's South Shore. It was a fish town in those years, for most Vermilionites were either fishermen or had been. Now, as times have changed, bringing new opportunities, the North Shore Canadians produce the fish for public consumption with their fleet of some 200 modern, steel, diesel fish catchers. Photo date, 1927. First Yacht in Town. By George Wakefield. Tom Ball had served his stint in the Union Army and settled in Vermilion with his fish box and boat building business. His shanty was north of Huron Street in front of Dr. Stack's house today. The place was demolished by Cliff Parsons after he built his fish tug Eclipson there in 1920. Tom was a fine old gent when I knew him in 1916 and always had a cigar in his mouth, either chewing it or smoking it, as was the custom in those years. This scene on the river, 50 feet north of Huron Street, shows his boat the Iona, the first yacht in town, after he had taken the Grand Army of the Republic Band on a joy ride on his bandwagon. I can identify several in the photo. The first kid on the left is Ralph. Punks. Law. We fish for carp on the marsh side of the river. Alice Buell holds the snare drum while sitting on the timber dock. Carrie Boss, Tom's girlfriend, stands in the cabin on the right. Hank Rise sits at the bow. He was a marvel with the cornet in the band. And Tom stands just to the right of the forward mast and the Union Jack. This picture was taken by Pearl Roscoe of the Vermilion News via a glass plate negative in 1915 when Tom was the first Commodore of the Vermilion Boat Club. Edson's Creek by George Wakefield. Nelson Parsons owned the land around Edson's Creek in the 80s, so his grandchildren played around the creek's mouth, as shown in this picture of 1898 by A.D. Ennis, the local photographer. Nelson's house stands to this day just south of Don Inglebrie's house on the southwest corner of Liberty and Decatur Streets. Edson's Creek provided a wonderful playground with a wooden bridge, docks to fish from, a clay bank for climbing, and shallows for wading. We fishing kids used to gather leeches for bait from under the rocks. Artie Copeland and I played our first and last hooky at the foot of that clay bank when we were innocent third graders. Is hooky a long-forgotten word these days? This picture is of former Vermilionites, now all gone, when they were young folks at play. The location is at the west side of the creek at Dr. Adams Beach today. There was a fish shanty there in 1898, and these two sailboats were moored out front. Note the big sea outside and the small breakers near the beach. This was due to the shallow water after the erosion of Huron Street. When water was high, as in a northeast gale, the boats would be moored in the safety of the creek. The kidders in the boat are left to right. Alice, Bob, Grace, Det, and Cliff Parsons having a big day in the double-ended fish boat. The chap in the other boat may be Jim Stone, a relative. The old Bassett property is in the background. Ever hear of Port Edson? Song of the Reels by George Wakefield. This harbor scene of 1905 is a dandy, for it shows the lighthouse, stone pier, and iron catwalk, the marsh in its original state untouched by friend or foe, Rainy Shanty on the left, and the Kishman Fish Company land and net house on the right. There are 2 piles of coal for fueling the steam tugs that took on a ton or more every day they fished. Net reels are scattered around the lot. In the 20s, when the fishing fleet had grown, there were more reels. Often, I heard the song of the reels played along the riverside when the fishermen turned and spread the nets. It was a haunting, mournful tune that has now been forgotten by most Vermilionites, but it was there. When the Rainy Fish Company left the port around 1900, the shanty was left free for us kids. We had a ball in that large and empty shanty, from the attic to the basement, the French restaurant today. The part on the photo was sleeping quarters for the Rainy crews and was torn down sometime in the 20s. So, if you missed the river view, a good look at the way it was. And for a gill net reel, take a quick peek at the model Don Parsons set up at the marina. For this photo and the bandstand before, we can thank Karen Matthews, who is an avid collector of local postcards. River Reflects the Ages by George Wakefield. The meandering, pristine river is seen from the old nickel plate Norfolk and Western, bridge in 1905. What a lovely stream. About the same time as when the Indians reigned supreme on the old river, when the stream was chock full of bass, pike, muskellunge, perch, whitefish, and sturgeon. In those years, a person could live from the fish caught in this bountiful stream. Animals like the mink, muskrat, otter, beaver, fox, bear, wildcat, and deer used the river for food and drink. Then there were the ducks and geese that provided food and fun for the natives and animals. All in all, the river was the lifeblood and gathering magnet for man and beast in the age of giant trees in the wilderness that covered the countryside. So, the river stands today as a symbol of the ages in its cunning majesty, silently, persistently, forever. If you are a romanticist, this photo can trigger a pleasant mental visit to our native river valley that lay undisturbed by man for over 10,000 years. Shades of the ages abound in this track of flowing water. The card was published by C.H. Noon, graduate of pharmacy, for Linwood Park visitors. They like to send "Wish you were here" cards to their friends. This period is now known as the postcard age, which gave us all this interesting local history. Again, thanks to Karen Matthews. Riverside Boardwalk by George Wakefield. There are few folks in town who can tell where this boardwalk used to run. It is the way to the dollhouse. Seen to the right, that cute architectural gem of a summer residence located between the New York Central and Nickel Plate tracks in the 20s. It was on the west side of the river opposite to where the Jevons Marina is today. The rather flimsy path crossed the slough that ran from the river to the Nickel Plate embankment, one of the old riverbeds when the river ran along the west side of the valley. This whole area was mostly swamp land and vulnerable to flooding. The town dump was at the upper end of the slough. This lagoon was a grand place for carp and frogs to live in the lazy backwaters of the river, while the ducks nested in the reeds of the cattails. The overhead sign above the slough reads, "Positively no trespassing in the domain of the red-winged blackbird." Today, the city wastewater disposal plant is located where the dollhouse used to stand, and the boat ramp has displaced the boardwalk. The changing times have eliminated this slough and the lily pond at the first shale bank and have taken a toll on ducks and cattails along the riverside. Little Sloop School's Youth by George Wakefield. The Frederica was a sloop of the 20s owned by Colin Reed of Washington, Pennsylvania, who came to the Lakeside Inn every summer with his wife and 2 children. Lakeside Inn still stands as the big house on the north side of Huron Street near Washington Street. The house was built by Joseph Gilchrist in 1885. He was the leading entrepreneur in the lumber and shipping business that started in Vermilion. The ships made Vermilion a captain's town 50 years as local lads went to sea on the Gilchrist line. But getting back to the scene of the little sloop, Colin was not in town all summer, so when he was away the boys would play, naturally, with the Frederica. Aside from providing a lot of fun and sailing experience for the young river blood, she was equivalent to a sailing club today. She was also a lovely moonlight special for romantic interests of the aqua kind. So, the good ship Frederica proved to be quite a popular medium when Colin was in Washington. Perhaps she could be called a school ship, come to think of it. Harbor Reflections by George Wakefield. Mrs. Leahy of Ohio Street sent me the nicest postcard I have seen of the harbor entrance. Here is the old lighthouse, complete with the catwalk as it was in 1910. Along the east side of the river are Cloudy's. He was the ferryman, rowboats he had to let in the years when rowboating was fun and a stylish manner to cruise the river. The steam fish tug coming home from lifting nets is the William D. Ames, owned by the Driscoll Fish Company, Parsons Marina today. She is loaded quite deeply aft, so has a good catch of blue pike and perch. There is a power yacht following her into port. Cloudy's rowboats were husky and heavy boats, as I remember, but suitable for renters who often learn to row in one. Up the river at the Foster Boat House were some lighter and better boats made by Lyman of Cleveland, the same Lyman who moved to Sandusky. Later they became the Nash fleet of star boats, with stars painted on the bow. Note the lone fellow on the catwalk. He never had the slightest idea that we would mention him in this series in 1989. "1900 Pioneer Powerboat" by George Wakefield. Here we have an early powerboat on the Vermilion River near the first shale bank. The boat is the Olathe built by Frank Niggle in Cleveland near West 58th Street around 1900. She was built in the attic of his house, disassembled, and then assembled in his backyard. She is a typical type of the years, powered by a Buffalo engine, which proved very reliable. Some of the distinctive features are worth noting. The canoe stern, very much in vogue then. The high stern staff flying the big flag, perhaps reflecting the patriotism generated by the Civil War, very common then. The forward staff with an Olathe burgee. The canopy over the cockpit, designed to be lowered to cover the cockpit when the boat was in use, a clever arrangement and popular among open boats. I especially get a kick out of the conspicuous life ring, so handy there at the stern. Perhaps put there by the skipper to ward off fears his passengers might have going to sea in the good ship. A gasoline powerboat was something in those years, pioneering the internal combustion engine. Thanks to Melvin Niggle for the picture. Sandboat is a first by George Wakefield. Here is the sandsucker, Vermilion, docked at the old Driscoll Fish Company, Parsons today. The owner-builder, Big Ed Lamp, is aft watching the photographer, Rudy Mock, snap his vessel. She was built nearby at the foot of Sandusky Street and is just about ready to start mining sand for the paving of Liberty Street in 1920. Big Ed was a great innovator and had some good ideas and some poor ones. Consequently, this ship is the first of its kind and represented his idea of a working sandboat. Her hull was similar to his fish tugs, except considerably wider. She was strip-planked of cypress, edge-nailed, powered with two Wellman Seaver Morgan gasoline engines, incidentally made in Cleveland, and a large stationary engine for driving the sand pump. He later removed the derrick rig and put it at the foot of Huron Street. I recall how much fun we kidders had climbing up the piles of clean lake sand that had that day been at the bottom of Lake Erie. I also remember the mad fight Harry Krantz had with Carl Newman, which came to a draw on the sand. Ed finally lengthened his boat some 60 feet and used her at Lorraine for a few years until she burned there in the river. Perhaps too much gas aboard. Also, in the picture at the right is a view of the Fisher Steam Lumber Mill, perhaps the only photo in existence. More on this later. Lake Erie's Wrath by George Wakefield. It was one of those nights with a thunderstorm and a quick sea, enough high-velocity wind to whip the lake into a frenzy. Outside, towing two light sugar barges, a steam tow tug was caught with her lines short. The captain from down east wasn't familiar with Lake Erie weather, or he pooh-poohed the little pond, as so many salty boys do. At any rate, he caught it from the wrath of Mother Nature on the old lake, like so many pioneers did with their bateaus and canoes. The net result of being trapped in the night's fury was two barges on the beach and a tug in the river seeking shelter. This all happened many years ago, 1928 as I recall. In the morning, the remains of one barge appeared on the beach per the photo, the Main Street beach. Elton Fisher was soon on the wreck salvaging the new 2 by 10 bottom boards which were free for the picking. The other barge landed broadside to the Linwood Park beach where many photos were snapped that morning after the storm. Seldom have wrecks come to the Vermilion beaches, but every once in a while, with low water, you can spot a piece of waterlogged oak from a wrecked schooner of long ago. Their bones are still washing ashore after 150 years or more and carry a message long delayed in transmission. Old Jib, an unforgettable character. By George Wakefield. There have been river characters ever since the white man arrived and started messing around boats. And here is one who might be ranked as the classiest. Morris Snyder, better known as Old Jib or Giblets, as the gill netters called him, was a river rat of the highest order grown up from schooner days on the Great Lakes. He told me he once was shipwrecked on Lake Huron and floated off on a couple of planks and later rescued. He had, if you can believe it, been cook aboard the schooner. I knew little about his early life, but it must have been the rugged, wild, and carousing kind so typical of the sailors of the 19th century. Whatever, he portrayed an interesting individual in sight and sound. His dress was shabby of hand-me-downs people had given him. Voice was high-pitched of nasal quality, as if played on a gramophone. Still, he was generous and would give you half of anything he had. Once when I was aboard his fish boat, he was having his lunch, so I asked him what he was eating. His reply was, "It is tripe. Would you like some?" During the centennial in 37, we visited his home in the stove allotment, and he invited us to dinner. One remaining impression, a bottle of milk that stood out in the drab surroundings like a lighthouse. Jib was an unforgettable river character, and this photo I snapped in 1926 perhaps tells more about the old rascal than my best words. I knew most of the river folks in the 20s, and Jib is the one who stands alone as a fellow who subsisted in a lonely, hard world without a whimper. He had made his bed and slept in it contentedly throughout his life. The Star Fleet of 1919 by George Wakefield. The first starboats came to the harbor in the summer of 1919. They were built in Wyandotte, Michigan, and sailed down by a temporary crew of young Vermilionites garnered hurriedly from sailor-minded youths. The contract price for each 22-foot sailboat was $360. One was raffled off by the Vermilion Boat Club, and who would have the winning ticket but Charlie Decker, the local coal dealer. He operated where the Hull Company is today along the Conrail tracks. Colin Reed, a summer bird from Washington, Pennsylvania, and Harry Chandler bought the second boat and named it Starling. Al Wakefield purchased the third boat, Twinkle. In this snapshot, we see the fleet of 1919 laying at the foot of Huron Street, where the big schooners were built, as a reminder of the changing times coming to the river. Pleasure crafts taking the place of work ships, an omen of the future river traffic today. While observing this picture, I note the village diving board is on the right. We used to swim in the river in those days. Stub Rose could dive in with a lighted cigarette in his mouth and come up with it still burning. Lou Ritter and Pop Nichols would come down for a wash after a hot day's work and stand on the dock and suds up and kerplunk into the clean crick. To the left is the machinery building of Tom Ball's shanty and the famous Suicide Elm, we kids remember, where a fellow cut his throat. Historic Huron Street by George Wakefield. This ordinary and nondescript photograph appears like a regular lot line photo, but it has historic significance far beyond its appearance. The cameraman stood in the middle of Huron Street to snap the picture. The river is to the right with some boats hauled out for the winter. The engine there is a steam tractor used for pulling the boats up the ways in the slip. The fence at the left is the lot line of the Wakefield River property in 1929. Now, for the subtle and hidden remains which are the real meat of this picture. The mound in the foreground, behind the high corner post, is the site of the Huron Iron Company's two blast furnaces, a branch of the Geauga Iron Company of Painesville, Ohio. Just below the mound to the right were two circular foundations with signs of ore-colored soil nearby. These were built around 1830 and used bog ore, mined from the lands around Axtell. Not much more is known about production, but it is believed the operation ceased a few years later and moved south to Furnace Road where the road sign is today on Route 60. They may have wanted to be closer to the ore and charcoal timber. We are not certain and will perhaps never know the details. To the left of the elm tree in the photo was the location of the Minch lime kiln, as indicated by the mound of the foundation just visible through the bushes. Dr. Stack's residence is today just south of this old stone base of the kiln. The lime burned from Kelly's Island or Marblehead stone plastered many a house in this area. During World War I, Al Wakefield and Dean Quigley pushed over the iron stack for war scrap. Jake Karchin cut it up with his torch and sold it while the price was high. It was quite a sight to see the 45-foot stack crash to the ground in a fog of lime dust which ended Vermilion's chief air polluter. But in those years, the smoke was a source of jobs to the village and the citizens didn't object. So, this seemingly blank picture comes to life when flavored with a few drops of history. Song of the Wagon Bridge by George Wakefield. This postcard appears to be a 1915 view of the wagon bridge, so named because it carried wagons across the river. The first time I recall hearing that name was when Cliff Parsons referred to it when he was telling the story about Ed Lamp carrying a 200-pound box of net leads on his shoulder when he casually lit up a cigarette while talking to Cliff. Ed was a husky and tall fisherman, so he was properly called Big Ed Lamp. But getting back to the bridge, it was the town's first iron span and was erected in the 1870s, replacing the former wooden bridge. My favorite memory of the bridge was hearing the rods sing a melodic tune as a team rode across. Today, we tremble as trucks cross the current bridge. No song. Behind the bridge is the Southwest Fish Company, named after its location on the southwest shore of Lake Erie. This was Big Ed's company, and I believe he owned it with Mr. Patton. Ed later built a unique ice house, making it round rather than rectangular. In 1919, the whole place burned to the ground. The Union Boathouse at the right was owned by Bill Showalter and still stands to this day as the Snell Fish House. The glass cabin powerboat cruising up the river was quite modern in 1920. She could win the antique boat show today. The River's Puffing Dragons by George Wakefield. This 1904 picture of the harbor looking north from the old Fisher residence shows a busy harbor of steam fish tugs. In those days, you could smell the steamers with constant smoking stacks and puffing steam exhausts. They seemed like live things to me, warm with an eternal fire in their bellies. They moved along like silent dragons, blowing steam and heat from their open jaws. Of course, that is a child's image of the gill netters of yesterday. And like the dragons, the tugs are gone and have left only this passing photo. Let me review it for you. The two tugs in the foreground are laying at Bert Parsons' old dock. He died in 1897, but his house and dock remained for a few years. The tugs there are the James Burns and the Charm, typical open-deckers of the day. Their lack of net pullers required hand pulling over the bow, tough and cold work pulling in a half-mile of nets. George Rathbun told me you pulled and pulled, and even in the coldest weather you sweat and sweat. North from the Parsons dock is the Kishman plant running all the way to the Rainy Fish Company shanty. Incidentally, the buildings were not called barns but always shanties. Behind the Charm are two unknown tugs, perhaps gas boats. Then comes a white steamer that can't be identified. Laying next to her is perhaps the Fred Driscoll of the Kishman fleet. The last tug looks like the first Edward K. A Kishman boat built by Crozier in 1899. A fine large tug replaced by the Edward K. I knew it in 1915. The Rainy tugs were not in port when this photo was taken, so their dock is open. Away to the right is the waterworks showing steam exhaust at the riverside and smoke at the stack, which dates the picture. Note the windmill and the water tank soon to be dismantled because of the town water. Kishman also had a private water system. The residence left of the water tank belonged to Captain Leidheiser, one of the owners of the Leidheiser Brothers Fish Company. So was the river in the days of steam. What follows in the next 85 years no one knows, but it won't quite have the charm of this photograph. Picture by Pearl Roscoe of the Vermilion News. Photocopy by Wally Wheatley. The Outside Curve by George Wakefield. This enlarged view of the river, taken from Rainy Shanty in 1904, shows the river upstream from the last downstream photo. Consequently, we have total views of the stream from Rainy Fish House to the old Driscoll Fish Company, the busy part of the river. This portion of the stream was on the outside curve, and the deepest side ideally suited for deep-drafted vessels. As I view this picture starting at the right, the first fish tug is the Charm, followed by the James Burns. Just above the Burns is a neat pile of fence posts brought down from Michigan by the barge American Eagle, the Fisher Lumber Company ship. She was an old schooner on her last sea legs. She still has a sail rig at the main and foremast with booms hoisted high for unloading lumber. She still also sports a jib at her spiritless bow. The electric railway has come to town, as the poles along Liberty Street indicate. Upstream a bit more is the Leidheiser Fish Company with their two tugs, the James P. Devaney and an unknown tug. A shanty appears upriver a bit, and then comes the Driscoll Fish House in the distance. In scanning the skyline, the truss bridge of the Lake Shore and Michigan Southern Railroad shows, and then the steam mill of the Fisher Lumber Company, which still stands on Toledo Street, a fine example of sturdy, wooden mill construction. Next, we have the office of the lumber company in brilliant white with the Lake Shore and Michigan Southern Railway water tank showing above the lumber company building. To the extreme right is the new Fisher building, which burned in circa 1935, which was just east of the Fisher residence. How nice it is to be able to view the old river as it appeared in the eyes of Pearl Roscoe, our early photographer.